You'd think landing on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list means you're some criminal mastermind, calculating, elusive, always one step ahead. But some fugitives made it to the list only to get caught in the most ridiculously stupid ways imaginable. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. Meet Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, a man in the Bonanno crime family, a lifelong gambler, and the guy who unknowingly mentored an undercover FBI agent right into the heart of the mafia. You could say Lefty had two things going for him. He talked too much, and he trusted all the wrong people. Back in the late 70s, Lefty was introduced to a guy named Donnie Brasco. Donnie was slick, knew his way around jewels, and had that streetwise charm mobsters love. So Lefty took him under his wing. What Lefty didn't know was that Donnie Brasco was actually FBI agent Joseph Pistone on an undercover mission that would become one of the most legendary takedowns in FBI history. But Lefty didn't just accept Donnie. He vouched for him. He mentored him, worked with him, even had him as best man at his wedding. Donnie became family, which, in the mob, means you're either being groomed for greatness or to take the fall. And fall they did. The real twist came when Lefty started getting suspicious, not because of Donnie's strange past or convenient access to boats and jewelry, but because of a Time magazine article. Lefty was flipping through the magazine, catching up on the world, and saw a photo of an FBI yacht used in a different sting operation. That boat looked exactly like the one Donnie had brought to a party months earlier. Now, most people might have gone suspicious, but Lefty let Donnie talk his way out of it, claiming he had no idea the yacht was connected to the feds, and Lefty believed him. Meanwhile, Lefty's gambling addiction had him so deep in debt, he was hiding assets from his own crew and was practically broke. And while the mob tolerated a lot, murder, extortion, racketeering, but a guy who couldn't stop betting on horses? That's where they drew the line. His criminal earnings were going straight to cover his debts. Still, he stayed loyal. Even after the FBI came knocking in 1981, the Donnie Brasco operation blew wide open. Lefty refused to believe Donnie was a Fed. "He'll never go against us," he said. Spoiler alert, he did, on the stand, in detail. Lefty was arrested, convicted of racketeering, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. When he finally got out in 1993, cancer beat the mob to him. He died a year later. Nick George Montos. Nick George Montos had a criminal record longer than a CVS receipt, and not the petty shoplifting kind. He was a seasoned burglar, jail escape artist, and proud associate of the Chicago outfit. He got so cozy with crime that the FBI named him one of their 10 most wanted fugitives, 2 separate times. Montos got his start early, ditching school in the 1930s and diving straight into a life of crime before he could legally vote. From breaking and entering to armed robbery, he tried every sort of crime. He escaped prison multiple times, beat up a 74-year-old man and his sister during a robbery, tried to rob a freight train, and somehow made it through the revolving doors of America's justice system for decades. He was even imprisoned in Alcatraz. You'd think all this would teach him to lay low eventually. But no. Montos had other plans. By 1985, Montos was back at it again, this time attempting to rob a jewelry store in Hammond, Indiana, with 3 other crooks. But here's when it takes a twist. The crew brought walkie-talkies to coordinate their heist, which sounds smart, until you realize they were broadcasting on police frequencies. That's right. Every "we're inside" and "move to the back" was basically a live podcast for local law enforcement. The police didn't even have to trace the signal. They just tuned in like it was drive-time radio, And sure enough, they caught Montos and his crew in the act, red-handed. But true to his slippery nature, Montos posted bail and vanished, this time fleeing to Greece. For almost a decade, he managed to disappear, proving that even the dumbest mistakes don't always lead to immediate lessons learned. Then, in 1995, at the ripe old age of 79, Montos tried robbing an antique shop in Brookline, Massachusetts. He tied up the 73-year-old store owner, an elderly woman, no less, and hurled a disgusting anti-Semitic slur at her. But Montos messed with the wrong grandmother. She escaped, grabbed a baseball bat, and beat that man into defeat. Montos was convicted and sentenced to up to 40 years in prison. He spent his final years as Massachusetts' oldest inmate, filing failed parole pleas while battling heart problems. He died in 2008, still behind bars, and still waiting on an answer to his last plea for freedom. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader wanted to be famous. Rader wanted to be the headline, the mystery, the monster lurking in the shadows of suburban Kansas, and for a while, he pulled it off. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader murdered at least 10 people. He broke into homes, bound his victims, often with whatever he could find lying around, then tortured and killed them, often by strangulation. He was calculating, controlled, and for nearly 20 years, completely untraceable. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, like a personal brand for evil. But what made Rader especially unnerving wasn't just the murders. It was the way he treated them like a hobby. He sent letters to newspapers and police describing the crimes in disturbing detail, demanded recognition, and kept trophies like women's underwear and IDs. When the letters stopped in 1979, everyone hoped BTK had died or been locked away for something else. Unfortunately, he was just biding his time. Then, like a sequel no one asked for, BTK returned in 2004, 13 years after his last known murder. Apparently, Rader missed the spotlight. He began sending letters again, filled with puzzles, fake IDs, creepy poems, and even false confessions to crimes he didn't commit, just to stir the pot. He mailed packages with dolls tied up like his victims. He signed his name with flair. He dropped cereal boxes around town as calling cards. BTK was back, and he wanted everyone to know. But here's where the story turns from terrifying to just plain stupid. In the middle of all this cat-and-mouse chaos, Rader made one fatal mistake. He wrote to police and asked if he could safely send them a floppy disk without getting caught. He asked, "Can I be traced if I send a disk?" The Wichita police, seizing the moment, responded publicly via a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle, "Rex, it will be okay." So Rader, ever the trusting soul, mailed in a purple Memorex floppy disk in February 2005. What he didn't know, because apparently he skipped How Computers Work 101, is that floppy disks contain metadata, which contains your information like the user's name and the last modified computer. The disk led authorities straight to a computer registered at Christ Lutheran Church, and to one name in particular: Dennis Rader, president of the church council. Cross-referencing his vehicle with a blurry surveillance image and using DNA from a relative's medical sample, police closed in. 30 years, 10 murders, a city haunted. And it all came crashing down because BTK asked the police a yes or no question and took their word for it. He was arrested without resistance and confessed almost immediately. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences and is now serving time at El Dorado Correctional Facility. Dennis Nilsen. Dennis Nilsen was many things: A former police officer, a civil servant, a mild-mannered North Londoner with a penchant for poetry, and, as it turned out, a serial killer who stored corpses in closets. Between 1978 and 1983, Nilsen murdered at least 12 young men and boys, all within the 2 flats he called home. The press would later dub him the Muswell Hill Murderer, but if you're looking for a name that really fits the ending, the Blocked Drain Butcher might be more appropriate. Nilsen had a system: lure vulnerable young men to his flat, many homeless, some simply lonely, then strangle them, occasionally finishing the job with drowning. Afterward, he'd bathe the bodies, dress them, and keep them around like morbid roommates. When decomposition finally demanded action, he'd dismember them and dispose of the parts, either by burning them in his backyard or, more inventively, flushing them down the toilet. By February 1983, Nilsen had moved into a top-floor flat at Cranley Gardens, a place without access to a garden for burning bodies. So he leaned heavily into DIY plumbing, regularly sending flesh and bone fragments through the pipes. Eventually, this led to a truly British scene: tenants complaining about a blocked drain. Then comes Michael Catron, a plumber, who, expecting a bit of grease and hair, opened the drain cover and found something that looked suspiciously like human meat and bones. To this, Nilsen, ever the cheeky ghoul, casually remarked, "Looks like someone's been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken." Catron and his supervisor wisely returned the next morning. But by then, mysteriously, the drains had been cleared. This only deepened suspicion. After some more poking around, they found bones resembling a human hand and immediately called the police. The remains were confirmed human and traced via the plumbing to the top floor, which was Nilsen's flat. When police knocked on his door, Nilsen invited them in. The place reeked. When asked again about the drains, he gave a clumsy attempt at shock and innocence. Good grief. How awful. The detective, now thoroughly done with the charade, responded, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen didn't run, didn't resist, didn't lie. He simply gestured toward a wardrobe and said, "It's a long story. I'll tell you everything. Not here. At the station." Inside the wardrobe were 2 plastic bags filled with remains had been cooked. In the car on the way to the station, when asked how many people he'd killed, Nilsen stared out the window and said, 15 or 16, since 1978. The investigation would uncover a horror show: severed heads, organs in shopping bags, dissected limbs in tea chests, skulls stored like souvenirs. Some of the remains had been boiled, others flushed, which ultimately led to his arrest by a drain technician who just wanted to get home on time. Nilsen was calm, cooperative, disturbingly articulate. He even admitted he didn't know why he killed, only that he often didn't decide to until the moment before. His trial ended with 6 murder convictions and 2 for attempted murder, earning him a life sentence that later became a life tariff. He died in 2018 in prison, not by justice but by a ruptured aortic aneurysm after surgery. Ralph Bucky Phillips. Ralph James Bucky. Phillips wasn't your average career criminal. He was the kind who started his criminal activities in his childhood days. Born in 1962 and raised in Stockton, New York, Bucky's early life was marked by instability. He ran away from an abusive father as a child, and from that point on, running became his lifelong pattern. By the time Phillips found himself in the Erie County Correctional Facility in April 2006, he had already built up a long rap sheet of burglaries, grand larceny, parole violations, and escapes. He'd served time, broken out, been caught, and repeated the cycle for decades. but it was what he did in 2006 that would make him infamous across the country and land him on not one but two of the nation's most high-priority fugitive lists: the FBI's 10 Most Wanted and the U.S. Marshals' Top 15. The 2006 escape was almost too bizarre to be believed. He cut through the jail's kitchen roof with a can opener, and just like that, he slipped into the woods of western New York and vanished. Over the next 5 months, he would break into cabins, steal cars, and seemingly outsmart law enforcement again and again across New York and Pennsylvania. At first, the chase had an almost mythical energy around it. Locals started treating Bucky like an anti-hero. Restaurants sold Bucky burgers in to-go boxes. T-shirts read, "Where's Bucky?" and "Run, Bucky, run." A folk musician even released a song in his honor. But behind the folk hero narrative was a very real threat. Because Bucky Phillips wasn't just hiding, he was escalating. On June 10th, 2006, Phillips crossed a deadly line. State Trooper Sean Brown approached a stolen car in the town of Veteran, New York. As he got close, Phillips opened fire, hitting Brown in the abdomen. The trooper barely survived, and a few weeks later, investigators recovered a backpack and a .38 caliber handgun that tied Phillips to the shooting. But even then, the manhunt dragged on, with police always just a step behind. At one point in August, they were reportedly minutes too late in catching him on the Tuscarora Indian Reservation. A few days later, he slipped away from a complex where officers found several people accused of sheltering him. Then, the situation turned even more tragic. On August 31st, police were staking out the home of Phillips's ex-girlfriend in Pomfret, suspecting he might return. What happened next was an ambush. From the woods nearby, Phillips opened fire with a high-powered rifle. 11 rounds were fired. Trooper Donald Baker Jr. was hit in the flank and severely wounded. Trooper Joseph Longobardo was struck in the leg, his femoral artery severed. He died a few days later, despite doctors attempting to save him by amputating the limb. He was 32 years old. At that point, Phillips was no longer the "Run, Bucky, run" fugitive. The manhunt turned desperate. The reward for his capture climbed to over $40,000. His ex-girlfriend, Casey Crowe, was thrown back in jail after her bail was revoked. And Phillips, despite everything, was still out there, armed, dangerous, and determined to stay free. But his luck finally ran out. On September 8th, a Warren County Sheriff's deputy spotted him in a lightly wooded area in Pennsylvania. He radioed his location to nearby troopers. This time, Phillips didn't run. As officers moved in, he surrendered with his hands raised, ending the largest manhunt in New York State history without another shot fired. Just a few months later, Phillips stood in court and, without hesitation, pleaded guilty. In his own words, he said he was guilty as hell. He was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of Trooper Longobardo, and 2 separate 40 years to life terms for the attempted murders of Troopers Baker and Brown. Today, he's serving his time at the Upstate Correctional Facility in Malone, New York. Thomas Holden. Thomas James Holden was a man whose entire life was a masterclass in organized chaos. A former payroll thief turned notorious bank robber, Holden made headlines from the Roaring Twenties to the Cold War, setting records not for any act of brilliance, but for his criminal persistence. He wasn't alone in his exploits. Alongside his partner in crime, Francis Keating, Holden roamed the American Midwest in the late 1920s and early 30s, robbing banks, mail trucks, and even trains with clockwork precision. In 1926, they pulled off their biggest score, hijacking a U.S. mail truck in Evergreen Park, Illinois. and vanishing with $135,000. After 2 years of chase with the feds, the duo was finally caught and sentenced to 25 years in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. But prison wasn't the end of the road for them. It was just another pit stop. On February 28, 1930, Holden and Keating escaped with the help of forged passes allegedly provided by none other than George Machine Gun Kelly. After their jailbreak, they headed to the criminal playground of St. Paul, Minnesota, where they built a new crew. Among them were familiar faces like Harvey Bailey, Frank Jelly Nash, and Machine Gun Kelly. The gang launched a spree of daylight bank robberies that became increasingly violent and increasingly sloppy. Their bank heist in 1930 in Wilmar, Minnesota, netted $70,000. Their Lincoln, Nebraska job brought in $40,000. Then came the crown jewel, a $2.6 million securities heist. That kind of money should have been enough to retire, but this crew didn't know when to stop. A few months later, they hit a pair of bank messengers in Duluth for $58,000. Then a Menominee, Wisconsin bank for $130,000. But things started going south. Fast. During their escape from the Menominee job, they kidnapped a man named James Kraft, the cashier and son of the bank president. He was found murdered shortly after. Then, 2 of the gang members, Charlie Harmon and Frank Weber, also turned up dead, likely executed by their own partners for the fallout. Suddenly, the gang wasn't just robbing banks. They were wiping out anyone who might compromise them. With heat building, Holden and Keating joined the Carpus Barker gang, rolling deep with legends like Fred Barker, George Kelly, and Verna Miller. Together, they hit a Fort Scott, Kansas bank in 1932 and made off with $47,000. But it didn't last long. Less than a month later, federal agents found Holden and Keating playing golf with Harvey Bailey in Kansas City. While the feds moved in, another gang member slipped away, but was later found dead, likely taken out by his own crew on suspicion of being a snitch. Holden was sent back to Leavenworth and stayed there for nearly 2 decades. But even after 20 years behind bars, he hadn't changed. In 1947, he was released on parole. Just 2.5 years later, he shocked the country again. Not with another heist, but with cold-blooded murder. In a drunken family argument in Chicago, Holden shot and killed his wife and her 2 brothers. 3 lives lost in a single night. In March 1950, Thomas Holden was announced as the first ever fugitive on the newly created FBI 10 Most Wanted list. And 15 months later, on June 23, 1951, he was spotted by an old acquaintance in Beaverton, Oregon, who recognized his photo in a local newspaper. Holden had been hiding under the alias John McCullough, living quietly and working as a plasterer. The fantasy of a normal life came to an end when police arrested him at his job site without a fight. He was extradited back to Chicago, confessed to the murders, and was sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars 2 years later, ending a criminal career that had spanned 3 decades, multiple states, dozens of lives ruined, and one very historic distinction. He wasn't the most brilliant criminal or the most feared. But in 1950, Thomas Holden made history, not for what he stole, but for being FBI fugitive number 1. So much for criminal genius. From broadcasting heists on police radios to obsessively inserting themselves into cold cases, these fugitives weren't brought down by elite FBI tactics. They practically turned themselves in. Which one do you think made the dumbest move? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.